I want to talk about people who basically get frozen in place by some sort of ray directed at them by alien visitors. This has happened. It happened. It used to happen a lot, apparently, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, back in those times. I mean, it doesn't seem like we have a lot of landing cases, but back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there were a lot of people, and sometimes in the 80s too, there were some. These days, it doesn't seem like we have a lot of landing cases where people come upon beings. These beings landed somewhere and like doing things, either picking up foliage off the ground, or doing taking samples from of the earth. It seems like that kind of thing was happening a lot. It seemed in decades past, but nowadays it's just not. You don't hear a lot of landing cases. I wonder what's going on with that. I mean, why were there all these landing cases back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and now it's these days you just don't hear a lot of stories about this. I wonder if the aliens got smarter as time went by, or they don't need to do that kind of stuff anymore. I don't know, but whatever the thing is, whatever the reason, things are different now with regard to those kind of encounters than they were then. And anyway, but some of the cases back then, you had people who actually, come upon these things, landed out, in their yard or on their property or nearby, and the next thing you know, they're getting basically zapped, and paralyzed, and they can't move. And there were a lot of different cases. And just recently, the one YouTube channel I follow, UFOB, had a little snippet of a case that happened in 1965 in France that involved a gentleman who got zapped, basically, and was frozen in place. And I want to talk about that, and also a different case that happened 11 years earlier. But anyway, here's an article, thinkaboutit.docs.com. I'll leave the link for it. And it's about a guy named Maurice Massé. A farmer is detained by aliens in France on July 1st, 1965, at about 5:45 in the morning in the region of Valensole-Bassée Alps, France. Farmer Maurice Massé was inspecting his field of lavender when he heard a whistling sound, then noticed an egg-shaped object with 6 thin legs and a central pedestal standing nearby. Massé later said the object was about the size of a small car, and he could see 2 seats inside an open doorway. At the same time, he also saw 2 small boys, humanoid-looking beings less than 4 feet tall, dressed in grayish-green one-piece coveralls. Massé reported that they appeared to be gathering handfuls of his lavender. He said they had large, hairless heads, smooth white skin, large slanted eyes, pointed chins, and small mouths with no lips. Massé heard them make soft gurgling sounds as if communicating. When he approached, one of them pointed a small tube at Massé, which immediately immobilized him where he stood. He remained conscious, watching as they finished their task, and then entered the egg-shaped object, which rose off the ground, moved quickly away, then suddenly disappeared a few moments later. Massé was left standing paralyzed in his field, but regained his mobility about 15 minutes later. Now, I just want to stop there for a second. Now, sounds like, if you think about it, this is very similar to a case that happened in 1964 in Sorico, New Mexico, where a police officer, Lonnie Zamora, saw an egg-shaped object landed, and there were 2 beings standing out of the craft, walking around the craft, and he tried to get a better look at it, and the next thing, one of them saw him, and then the thing, they got in the craft and took off. Now, he wasn't frozen in place like this guy was. But if you get too close, if you come upon these beings, they have the power basically to freeze you in place. Now, again, I just find it strange again that you don't hear a lot of these kind of cases nowadays. Like, it's like they don't do this anymore, it seems, or if they are doing it, they've come up with some new way to do it without anyone seeing them, I guess. Who knows how they get away with it, if they are still doing it. But anyway, 2 years after the close encounter, Maurice Massé stands at the landing site. That was just a picture. It says, Massé reported his encounter in detail to local authorities, including the mayor of Valensole, his parish priest, and the cops. The site was thoroughly inspected, and Symmetrical marks were found in the ground exactly where Massey said the legs of the object had been. It was later discovered that lavender would not grow on that spot for a period of 10 years. Again, that's another interesting aspect of these cases where when these objects land, they do things to the soil. This was something that a guy named Ted Phillips from the Midwest. This guy investigated a whole bunch of landing cases, and he would investigate the physical trace evidence that was left behind. And basically what he had discovered is that the earth where these things had landed and took off, it would be very difficult to grow anything on it, because the earth was so dried out that it couldn't even it couldn't absorb water. Like, the water would be, if you take a sample of this earth from a landing site and you put it in water, the earth would float, where earth from nearby that wasn't part of the landing site would actually turn into mud. For whatever reason, the earth where these things land is basically drained, devoid of any the minerals, or devoid of any form of life. Basically, it just can't. For some reason, it's useless. Like, you can't grow anything with it. Anyway, it continues here. 4 days after the encounter, Massey began to experience bouts of profound drowsiness, which caused him to require more than 12 hours of sleep every day for the next several months. Despite his reported immobilization by the humanoid beings and his later health difficulties, Massey said he had a positive feeling about his encounter. Massey was well known and highly respected in his community, and all the local authorities who examined his claims reached the conclusion that he was telling the truth. So it's a very interesting story, but what's interesting to me about it is the fact that he was frozen in place. That these beings have the ability, basically, if you were to come up, if you're out somewhere, say you're taking a walk through the woods, and you came across one of these landed craft, and they happen to see you, they could do things to you from a distance that is going to basically freeze you in place. And that happened in a different case back in 1954 in France. 1954, there were a whole bunch of alien encounters in France. They call it, actually, it's been known as the Great 1954 Alien Invasion of France. Anyway, this was a guy named Marius de Wilde. He was a French railway worker. And anyway, de Wilde lived in a house by the tracks close to the railway station at Quarobel Nord, France. According to de Wilde, on the night of September 10th, 1954, his dog started barking at 22:30. De Wilde initially ignored the dog, but went outside with a flashlight after his dog continued to bark frantically. He walked towards the tracks, and he saw an object some 6 or 7 meters away from him. Behind him, he could hear some steps. When he pointed the flashlight, De Wilde saw 2 humanoid figures, about 80 centimeters to 1 meter. When the light was pointed to their heads, it reflected as if they were wearing a mirror helmet or something. Suddenly, a light beam came off the object he saw on the tracks and left him paralyzed. He slowly looked back and saw a door opening at the object behind him. The beings boarded the object, and it took off towards the sky, changing its colors in the meanwhile. When he recovered his movements, he attempted to tell his wife and then his neighbor of what he had just seen, but neither of them had seen nor heard anything. He then tried the local police, which sent some police officers to his home. De Wilde could not approach the point where everything happened because it made him feel sick, giving the officers a certainty that his story was not a hoax. Also, objects which are energized by battery, like De Wilde's flashlight and telephone, stopped working. Before sunrise, investigators were already all over the place. When people were investigating the point, an approaching train produced a very loud noise when passing by, making it stop. A 6-meter depression was found on the exact point where the object had landed and was immediately said to be the cause of the noise. By light of day, more details were uncovered. The small rocks under the train tracks were all carbonized on the depression. The sleepers between the steel lines also featured some symmetric marks. The incident was made famous by the local magazine Radar. Following the incident, there were other occurrences. De Wilde suffered from respiratory problems, and his dog died 3 days after the encounter. 3 cows in nearby farms were found dead, and their autopsies revealed that their blood had been totally and unexplainably removed. Also, several local people claimed sightings of objects and creatures similar to the ones witnessed by DeWild. So there was a lot of people seeing these things at the time. But isn't that interesting? Look at all that stuff that happened right in that little area there. So the guy, in addition to everything else that's going on, there was 3 dead cows with the mutilated, with their blood removed. Isn't that something? Again, people are still trying to deny that we have some presence here. But I guess the bottom line is something froze this guy in place and he couldn't move, just like the other guy in France in 1965, frozen in place and you can't move. These aliens have the ability to basically cause you to freeze like a statue, and this is very interesting. But I just wonder why it doesn't happen anymore. We just don't hear that. There's not a lot of cases like this anymore where people actually come upon these beings, examining things in a field, like, or sitting on railroad tracks, or whatever was going on back then. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And there's a lot of cases like this. There were so many cases with people coming upon these things. But it's interesting, the DeWild case, because the fact that nearby there were 3 cows drained of blood. We really didn't. People really didn't start talking about cattle mutilations until 1967, where there was a case where there was a horse that was found mutilated. It happened very suddenly, but actually, it looks like it was going on a long time before that. In fact, there were cases in the 1800s where people were finding these things, but it really wasn't until the 60s where people started putting 2 and 2 together, that these cows were actually being mutilated. Apparently by extraterrestrial visitors. So it's just you wonder though. It's basically out of science fiction stories. Freeze rays, and they basically have that ability. In addition to being able to control you mentally by some means. But they have the ability basically to cause your body to freeze in place like a statue, and there's nothing you can do about it. That has to be extremely frightening. I would, if it happened to me, I think that would be very scary. I don't think I would like it one bit.